News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. I am Nick Barris. It is a Monday, and I hope you had a good weekend. We're kicking off the week. This is a live and direct program for you. I'm coming to you from our downtown studios on James Robertson Parkway, home of the News Channel 5 Network, Studio A. Mary Elena back there working the phones. We'll get the lines open for you in a moment. We are going to give you a chance to call in and join in the conversation. So many aspects, of course, to this coronavirus pandemic, and one big one, of course, is law enforcement, incarceration, jails, prisons, what the sheriffs are doing and how they're dealing with it. Of course, a lot of that happening here in Middle Tennessee, but we can also speak nationally because our guest, who so often, and he comes on every month with us, is sitting next to me because of social distancing. We're glad this morning that he's still available. Davidson County Sheriff Daron Hall joining us now by Skype. Good morning to you, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Nick. It's strange times, but it feels like old times.
It is a little different. Well, thank you for coming on. And again, of course, you know Daron Hall is the sheriff here in the Nashville metro area. He also, of course, is president of the National Sheriff's Association, so you can speak on both the national and local front. And Sheriff, I want to ask you, where we start here now with regard to us locally, perhaps, and how things are going. I know last week, I think your department had sent out an update on how many inmates had tested positive. I think it's gone from 8 to 11, and then you have right now 5 staffers that are positive. You had 6, but 1 is recovered. Any update on that front and what you're doing to address the issue as we continue to deal with this?
Yeah, Nick, I mean, I've never been around a subject that changes so fast and all this stuff, and it's ironic. Just since I've come on here, I was looking at my phone to get an update just 2 minutes ago that in the wee hours of the morning last night, there were 5 additional inmates that had been moved to our new facility. That's where we're housing all these isolated cases, and so what that basically means is that there's a new group, let's call them 5, who are symptomatic and obviously are going to be tested and so forth. The concern for me in that number, which the public wouldn't understand, and it's kind of complicated, but these are 5 people from a totally separate housing unit that has yet to have a case. And so if any of these, and I would almost assure you someone will be, that means the entire unit in which where they've come from has to be quarantined because of exposure. So it's 5 potential positives, but it's now 50 or 60 people that will be negatively impacted. They will be restricted from everything they get to do. And so when you run a facility like this, it's a lot like these long-term care facilities you're hearing a lot about all over the country. It is very hard to control and contain this thing. And once it gets running through a building, obviously, we have a lot of concern, and including our staff. It's just a very complicated subject.
Let me ask you this then. So to be clear, we've all been waiting to learn when the first inmates, whoever they may be, will be moved to the new facility, which, that other issue with the intruder and the weapons hidden, that's been resolved. We know you had the news conference on that, so it's ready to go. So are the first inmates now in the new facility?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We developed a housing plan, 6 weeks ago, and when the corona thing broke out, as to where we would isolate and move people around. And so in that plan, we always had a certain number. That number was 32. Once you got to a number of 32 needing to be isolated from everyone else in different capacities, we were going to be needing to use the new building. It has a lot of space to do that with. So I believe it was Friday night or Thursday night of last week and Friday morning, we started moving those cases that were either positive or awaiting results were symptomatic. In some exposure cases, we were moving those down to the new building. And so I wouldn't say we're not declaring that the building is, quote, open, because we're not booking people and using it as its official purpose, but it is serving as a housing unit, and it'll stay open now for the next couple of weeks until we get the booking room and everything else functioning. But and the note I just read, we moved 5 more people there somewhere around midnight last night that also started showing symptoms. And so everyone that's in the building is basically on some form of COVID-related isolation. It could be one of the 3 or 4 stages that you go through.
And so what's the total count then right now that's been moved over there at this point, counting the 5 from last night?
Yeah, you're somewhere in the neighborhood, let's see, 40, probably 88 or so. Very few of those are also some workers that were moved up, but I would say in the 60 range or isolated of some sort. We've got a handful of those that are up there that are inmate trustees and so forth helping us do some stuff, but that are also living there. But I would say 88 is a good number, and again, this is way inside baseball stuff, but our big concern now is we had this contained to one unit, and everyone we were dealing with was coming out of one housing unit. We now have, as of last night at 10:40, we have some additional cases in a different housing unit, which is going to cause us some very difficult things to deal with going forward.
And so is that the key? In a way, is it, not that I would call it a luxury, but the fact that that happened and you thought it could, that you have this new facility that's basically empty at this point, does that give you some wiggle room on this? Or, at what point does this become even more of a problem?
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate, and for a lot of reasons. One is we do have some available beds. We've been trying for the last month or so to get our population down, and that's helped significantly. But the building, it's so frustrating the way this thing has happened, but the building was designed with a really fantastic medical wing to it, division of it, and obviously has a lot of ability to separate individuals into individual cells. The housing unit where all of our problems have been so far, the facility anyway, is a dormitory style, which means you have multiple people in a big barracks type of situation. These are low-level security issues, inmates, but they're in a dormitory style, very open bay type of environment. The new building is not dormitory at all. It has individual cells, and so what you can do is separate people, which is what you need to do in these isolation cases. You can separate everybody, and that's what it allows us to do. And so we're using, like I said, a large portion of the building, and we're very fortunate to have it right now and not be fully functioning because we can separate some folks. And we need to get our hands around this and contain it in certain areas because we have 1,000 inmates, and we surely don't need, a large percentage of those to be involved with this COVID thing.
Okay. When we last talked, and I think you and I did an interview a couple of weeks ago or so, I think you were speaking both as the Davidson County Sheriff and also as the president of the Sheriff's Association. You expressed what I felt was, clearly some frustration over the ability right now to get the PPEs that you really need for your staff. And it's not just a local thing, but national. What's changed in that regard? Where are the greatest needs? Because I think right now an awful lot of people have of concern, not just for your correctional officers that are working there, but for the inmates themselves as we see some of these cases spark up.
Yeah, and let me go national first, if it's okay. I'm like everyone else. I was seeing press conferences nationally that, millions of these PPEs and various things are being moved all over the country and into jurisdictions and so forth. And as far as I could tell, and it wasn't just me. I was on the phone with a lot of the national leaders in law enforcement, police, and sheriffs, obviously, and EMT and fire and so forth. And we weren't seeing and feeling that at all locally. And Nashville's a pretty big jurisdiction, and if we weren't getting it, I know most of my colleagues, which, by the way, the vast majority of sheriff's offices are very small all over the country, I knew they weren't getting what they needed. And so that has gotten better. It's been a little late in the sense of trying to catch up, and it's for example, one of the things that people probably don't understand, especially in a jail setting, and it's far more. Chief Anderson and I were talking about this last week or so. People use the word front line a lot in the world of law enforcement, and most of the time, the dangers involved in law enforcement are on the front end. There's a lot of it because obviously you're dealing with people in the streets, and there can be all sorts of risks. And there is still a risk to the arresting officers and so forth. But in this case, the jails are far more difficult to manage than the front line. And I don't think the jails are getting enough attention in this country as it relates to how difficult this problem is. The healthcare field is clearly the most. But we're right there next to it because we're running a care facility, a long-term as in it runs all the time, And the police side of things is difficult because you're making an arrest. But the truth is, once you get that person to booking, you drive away, and obviously you would want to decontaminate your vehicle and make sure you're protected. But the truth is, the people who live in these jails and the other inmates, it is extremely difficult to manage. And so one of the problems nationally, and we are sure feeling that here, is, just imagine right now when we go and interact with one person who's positive in a jail cell, our officers are fully dressed in protective clothing, vest, mask, gloves, everything you have to wear. And that may be just to open the door to take their temperature. And so when you do that, and so does the medical staff, but I mean, we're talking about correctional officers. And so every time throughout a day, we're using 12 outfits of that a day on one inmate because of the various situations you may be involved with. And so just imagine the math. And right now, if I told you we have 88 and 5 new ones, just start doing the math of what you're going to need. And so when the president of the United States or vice president or someone stands up there and says, we're sending millions, well, you better send millions, because it is going to take a lot of work to make sure these staff are safe, and obviously inmates as well. We're giving masks to every inmate in our system. And if you just start talking about how many that is, you're really going to need a lot of this PPE stuff moving forward.
All right, real quick, we're going to go to a break, but just confirm for me again. When you say 88, again, that's some who have maybe been tested and you're waiting for results. In terms of positives, I think we heard maybe 11, and so you have maybe 88 that are still waiting to see the results, and you're sure some of them will likely be positive. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a good number. So the way they've told us medically is if Nick Barris is positive and Daron's symptomatic awaiting results, we both need to be isolated. Yeah. And obviously if my results become negative, we could do some. But the truth is we're finding most of these cases who were in the same cell a lot of times are some form of this isolation. And so to be honest with you, there's importance of being positive, but as far as isolation-wise, everybody from the person who was exposed to me in a cell block to the person who's awaiting test results to the person who's positive, all of them need to be isolated, quite frankly, from each other and everybody else. And so it becomes a very difficult housing setup because you're having to separate everyone from each other.
Gotcha. And real quick, as we go to break, you did say getting masks to all the inmates?
All the inmates have had a mask now for a week. Upon going to booking, you get one type of mask that's disposable because you may go home and so forth. If you live here, you get a mask that is actually able to be washed and reused. Okay. And all of our staff have a mask that will last for up to a year.
Gotcha. Listen, Sheriff, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we've got several questions from you on the phone. We're also streaming live right now on Facebook at newschannel5.com. And one of the questions a lot of people are asking right now is, and we know there was a court hearing on this, in fact, one where they called for you to answer a few questions, the question of inmates, maybe those who are nonviolent, being released and how that's going to be done, and whether or not we can clear out the jails to make some space for those who get sick. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll address that and more with Davidson County Sheriff Daron Hall right after this.